The optimism part is hard right now. I will tell you, it comes from young people. Entirely. They actually are the moral conscience of this country at this time.
Taking center stage is Maya Berry, Executive Director of the Arab American Institute. Her mandate includes combating hate crimes and creating a new Middle East and North Africa category for the United States Census and federal forms. Maya describes herself as a longtime Democratic Party activist. Her recent testimony at a congressional hearing on hate crimes left many stunned. Maya Berry, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
War in Gaza, and now Lebanon, has absolutely exacerbated anti-Arab sentiment and Islamophobia. We're in an election year, and it's feared by the Democratic Party that the Arab American vote is going to cost Kamala Harris her chance at becoming president. How would you describe the impact on the Arab American community in the last year, and what has your institute been focused on?
You're 100% right in pointing out that this is not a normal time. I don't think it's a normal time for our country overall in terms of threats to our democracy. And I certainly don't think it's a normal time for Arab Americans who have been for a long time keenly aware that U.S. policy in the Arab world has not done a very good job for the Arab population there, nor has it actually improved our own national security interests here. It's just that I think what we're seeing with the genocide in Gaza, with the extraordinary violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and now the expansion of that campaign into Lebanon, it's a different time in terms of trying to understand how does this play out in a way that is consistent with what we say are, one, our values, and two, in terms of our own national interest. In terms of how it will play out in an election year, well, we have the polling that demonstrates it. When we ask Arab American voters what their concerns are, they traditionally talk about jobs in the economy and healthcare and gun violence, like other voters. But you also have always seen the issue of Palestine rank higher than it would among sort of your average American voter. In our last poll that we just did on the Arab American vote for 2024, 81% of Arab Americans say Gaza is weighing heavily on their vote.
Did they tell you how many are actually planning on voting?
So the poll does ask your presidential preferential choice, and it came down within the margin of error, actually. 42% for Donald Trump and 41% for Harris, with a couple of the third-party candidates coming in at around 5 and 6%. And it's to be clear, it's an actual poll. We've been polling since the 1990s, mid-1990s, which means it's a statistical sample. Arab Americans have historically been about a third independent, and there's this battle in some ways between the Republicans and Democrats, where Democrats since at post-2000 have been 2-to-1 Democrat over Republican. What we saw with the poll that we conducted in October of 2023, which was that for the first time ever since we've been polling, more Arab Americans identified as Republicans and Democrats.
What do you attribute that to?
Gaza. Without a doubt. This idea that U.S. policy would enable and allow the unfolding genocide to take place has really jarred people in a way that's, I think, different than we've seen before. And as I said, the data bears that out. This is a well-educated constituency. It's not like they wake up and think that, the Palestinian liberation is going to rank, high among U.S. policymakers. So they understand that. But I think the idea that we would enable the genocide is just beyond the pale.
You recently testified at a congressional hearing on hate crimes in which a Republican senator from Louisiana told you, quote, "You should hide your head in a bag."
That's the moment that went viral for sure, and it should, honestly. That's an extraordinary way for anyone to behave, and certainly an extraordinarily inappropriate way for a member of Congress, a sitting senator, a person who I tried to explain to him during my exchange, has 31,000 Arab Americans that he represents as constituents. But the truth is that the ranking member, the first Republican to ask me a question, sort of started what I thought was, oh boy, I'm here to testify as a subject matter expert on the issue of hate crime in our country. An issue, by the way, that has grown year after year after year. Since the 2015 presidential campaign for the 2016 presidential election, we have seen a major surge in hate crimes in this country, targeting every community across the board, without a doubt.
What do you attribute that to?
I mean, look, we talk about the backlash effect. We talk about when something happens somewhere else in the world that sort of has nothing to do with us. You can talk about the oil embargo, or you can talk about the Gulf War, and you'll see an increase in hate targeting those communities. But I think what started with 2016 is that you saw at the highest levels elected officials and policymakers speaking in ways about policy. And I want to be clear on this point. You can have disagreements on policy. My goodness, I think we should have disagreements on policy. What's different is when you take a policy disagreement or a policy issue and then you start blaming a specific community for it. So during COVID-19, we saw an unbelievable surge in hate crime targeting the Asian American and AAPI community. Why does that happen? Well, because regrettably, we had an elected official who was calling something the China virus, quote unquote. So all of these things, anti-Semitism in this country actually has been increasing significantly. We have a very real problem with anti-Semitism here. The highest numbers of anti-Muslim hate crimes ever came post 9/11. The second highest year was 2016. When former President Trump was talking about the Muslim ban. I don't draw a correlation, but I would suggest that if the public discourse coming from policymakers suggests that there's a community that you can blame for the way you're feeling about something, we will see, regrettably, an increase in hate targeting that community.
You were talking about hate crimes against Arab Americans at the hearing. I assume that you brought up the 6-year-old Palestinian boy who was stabbed to death in the Chicago suburbs. His mother also stabbed. The 3 Palestinian American students shot in Vermont, leaving one of them paralyzed. You said that how is this year looking in terms of hate crimes? Because in my mind, it feels worse than 9/11.
It's a complicated issue when we talk about the anti-Arab data. And the reason for that is that the Hate Crime Statistics Act passed in 1990. The first time the FBI ever reported on hate crime data was in 1991. When they did so, there was a Code 31. Every community has a code. Code 31 existed for anti-Arab hate. It disappeared. It was not reported on for decades. Code 31 was not reintroduced and reported on until 2015. So that post 9/11 backlash that data is not available there.
Why did it disappear?
It's not clear. All I would say, though, is that when I talk about federal hate crime data, and I only use the federal hate crime data, I think it's absolutely essential that we only rely on the official government data. Organizations define things differently. A hate crime necessitates first that there's a criminal offense. And the reason we talk about it as a hate crime is, why was this person targeted for the crime? And it's because of relying on a protected category. All hate crime data is underreported. The Bureau of Justice Statistics at the Department of Justice thinks that only about 1% of hate crime data is actually reported. So when we received the data for 2023, just a couple of weeks ago, it said 11,682 hate crimes had taken place. Imagine that that's 1% of what we believe to be the actual number of hate crimes in our country. So it's a staggering amount of underreporting. And when you didn't have an anti-Arab category for decades and you had the complete erasure of a community, local law enforcement may not be very well trained on that category. I sat at that hearing, as you pointed out. I did talk about Wadia's mother, who was sitting in the row behind me. Wadia brutally murdered this beautiful 6-year-old little boy. His mother was stabbed 12 times in that same hate crime. And just a few down from her was a family from the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life Synagogue, where they lost their grandmother and their mother. There is an increase in hate in this country, and it needs to be addressed. And regrettably, instead of having that conversation fully at that hearing, half of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle, decided to kind of introduce these foreign policy conversations that didn't belong in that room.
Did anything substantive come out of it?
First of all, a hearing has to happen. It's important because there are some folks that are like, goodness, if our government is so broken that this is what happens at a hearing on hate crime. Why do we have them? We have to have them because there is an increase in hate and it needs to be addressed. And we need to examine what are the better ways in terms of putting our policy forward to address these issues. The part that's challenging, as I said, is that there were hearings on the House side where instead of focusing on the topic at hand, they became opportunities for viral moments. And I'm afraid that some of the senators on the Republican side attempted to do the same here. And it's really, really unfortunate. You had victims of hate crimes in the room when they did that.
Do you feel politics of the moment has literally been reduced to viral moments, one after the other?
Sitting in that chair, I saw one particular member who was just sort of on his phone or talking. By the time it came for the questions, the camera went on him, and it was like a light switch went on, and a completely different performance kicked in. So I do think that's part of what's playing out here.
Arab Americans have emerged as a critical voting bloc in the U.S. presidential election. Traditionally, Arab Americans have been reliably Democratic. Michigan is a battleground state, and it has the highest concentration of Arab Americans. Yet, as you pointed out earlier, there's a chasm within the Arab American community. Many are drifting to the Republican side. What role do you think Arab Americans will play in this election?
Yeah, so let me start institutionally answer, which is that we created Yalla Vote. Yalla, the Arabic word for, Yalla for everything, right? But we created Yalla Vote back in 1998. And it's a civic engagement program that encourages political participation. So the thing that just breaks my heart is when I hear folks saying they're going to stay home. We cannot have them stay home. It is absolutely critical that they vote in this election.
But what do you
Yalla
say
Vote
when
has
you say
never.
They want to vote their conscience?
Yeah, that's exactly what I say, actually. They should vote their conscience. Yalla Vote has never told, we're a nonpartisan organization. We've never told anybody for whom to vote for. We give you the information, we give you the positions of the candidates, and then you decide. But the only thing I would point is, as demoralizing as it feels in terms of thinking about the top of the ticket, and they should think about the top of the ticket, you mentioned Michigan, equally important in Pennsylvania, and Michigan and Pennsylvania are part of that wall for candidates during the strategy. With margins being so incredibly close, there's no doubt that a constituency like Arab Americans can play that role. But I would also point out that it's not just the presidential ticket, right? Down ballot races are also incredibly important for local communities. They have to participate, they have to vote, as difficult as it is. And the other point I would make, as folks are talking about this calculation about could Arab Americans cost, the Harris campaign, this issue is certainly paramount for Arab Americans, but we've also seen it playing out equally for other constituencies. Black voters are deeply concerned about this. Young people are deeply concerned about this. Progressive Jewish community members are deeply concerned about this. Latino voters are. It's the Biden coalition, right? The Biden coalition in its entirety says, I'm not comfortable with this being done in my name.
But Arab Americans I've spoken to have also talked about a backlash. They fear that if Harris loses, that it will reverberate back on the community, and yet again, they'll be dealing with more intolerance.
Yeah, the line we get is, are you guys comfortable destroying our democracy? And of course, I repeatedly explained to folks, first of all, that's entirely wrong. One, because we're not a single issue constituency, we're a diverse constituency. And second of all, it's a false choice. The harm to our democracy that's we've experienced has been going on for several years, regrettably. And I'm not proud to say that we've seen it from both parties. We've seen it from multiple segments of our political process. And that's concerning. There's a narrative that we're not fitting into for some folks. And I think that's part of, to be honest with you, I think that's part of anti-Arab racism, is to kind of not understand the complexity of a human being.
That we're not a monolithic group.
Yes, exactly. That's the point. It's like the process of dehumanizing us is to flatten us in such a way that the full complexity and diversity and thoughts and feelings about different issues are just eliminated, and we're just here. And I think that's part of what's been playing out that's really very heartbreaking.
This year, after a decades-long fight, the Biden administration announced that it was creating a category for Arab Americans on the 2030 census and federal forms. It's a Middle East, North Africa, or MENA category. It is a way to eliminate the decades of Arab Americans feeling officially invisible by the government while often being targeted. Why is the MENA category so important?
There is literally nothing that we do that isn't impacted by accurate data collection. And the race and ethnicity standards are the way that we do that. From political representation and the way that our congressional districts are drawn to the $1 trillion of tax dollars that are spent, there is nothing that is not touched by census data. And you're right that it has been a long process. The first time that we asked for a category was back in 1995, going into the 1997 revisions of the standards. That didn't
I think
happen.
people would find that absurd that up until this year, Arab Americans had to check white on the census, white on federal forms, when of course, Arab Americans do not share the same experience as white people.
The idea of having a MENA checkbox is an ethnic category. It's not a racial one. Arab Americans are white. Arab Americans are black. Arab Americans are brown. Arab Americans are a racially diverse community. They're an ethnicity. I mean, the Census Bureau's current number count for Arab Americans is just roughly over 2 million. Our estimate, and it's a low estimate, is 3.7 million. There's a massive undercount, and the Census Bureau and the Department of Commerce and the U.S. government have known that. So they actually have been a key partner in this process of getting us here. And I'm so excited because our 2020 campaign was literally check other. We told people check other and write it in. And you're right when you say that, like, they would check other and then write in their category, but we would be coded as white exclusively. So the point is getting to a place of finally having the MENA checkbox. One, it'll allow us to get to accurate data collection. And it's important for people to feel that their identity is there. So they can proudly say, I'm Egyptian, I'm Palestinian, I'm Yemeni, I'm Lebanese. Like, that's really huge.
This is a very traumatic moment for Arab Americans, and they feel like the intolerance and stereotypes that have been revealed anew are reminiscent of what the community was dealing with in the 9/11 era. How would you address this feeling that the Arab American community is still dealing with the same type of discrimination, the same type of stereotypes that have existed since the 1970s? And because of the work you do, how are you maintaining your optimism?
The optimism part is hard right now. I will tell you, it comes from young people. It entirely. I love that they're applying their moral compass the same exact way to every issue. They actually are the moral conscience of this country at this time, because what they've done is looked at what's happening and said, oh, but we did this in Ukraine and we said it's the right thing to do. So why isn't it the right thing to do here? Well, why can't we do it here is partly what you're talking about, which is we've dehumanized Arab lives in such a way that we don't relate to their targeting, their dying, their pain the same way. And that is incredibly difficult. I know that the United States policy is what enables the occupation of Palestine. It's what enabled the 76 years of dispossession. It's what's enabled now like the genocide in Gaza unfolding the way we've seen. And it's what's enabling the extraordinary bombings that are taking place in civilian urban centers in Lebanon and in the South, in villages. Like, this could not be happening were it not for U.S. policy. In terms of the post 9/11 to now, the post 9/11 environment was hard, obviously. I mean, AI President Jim Zogby talks about this, and I think the way he encapsulated it just is perfect, which is that we couldn't mourn 9/11 the same way, even though it was us that was attacked, because we somehow became suspect. People couldn't distinguish between that attack and the fact that your Arab American neighbors had nothing to do with it. I worked on the Hill on 9/11. I was evacuated on 9/11. I mean, we literally left, our offices running, thinking that another attack was coming at the time. There were Arab Americans that died in the Twin Towers, but that's not what we were allowed to do right away, right? We had to put something out. The thing about this now that's sort of different in some ways is the repression to shut down the understanding that's taking place. U.S. policy, as I said, has been harmful in the region for many, many years. And mainstream media doesn't do a particularly great job of discussing this issue. But the way it's broken through on social media platforms, particularly on TikTok with young people, the attempt to shut that down has resulted in First Amendment protected speech being compromised. It's resulted in professors and students being maligned simply for advocating for Palestinian human rights. It's resulted in congressional bills that are seeking to give power to the Secretary of the Treasurer so that they can remove the 501c3 tax status of organizations that people disagree with. It is extraordinary to see what is being attempted in this moment. That, I think, is different than what we saw post 9/11.
What has this fraught moment for Arab Americans shown you about the work ahead needed for the Institute in terms of civil rights?
One of the things that's very difficult in these crisis situations is it's a crisis. So you are on defense. You are constantly responding to what's happening and trying to make a very bad situation better, both in terms of U.S. policy there, our own weapons being used to cause this harm, and domestically in terms of the kinds of things that I've pointed out are happening. The challenge has been to do that while at the same time going a little bit macro to say our entire theory of change is about civic engagement. It's about making sure we participate in the political process. It's how we also think about moving forward. How do we have to do this differently in order to make sure that we don't find ourselves in the place we're at now? What's the capacity building that needs to take place for our communities so that we are better positioned to deal with the kind of onslaught that we're seeing now? The future will be better. It's inevitable. It's just the difficulty now of what's happening and the fact that it's not stopping. If you told me a year ago that we would be seeing not only that it continued, just seeing what's happened in the northern Gaza, the gentleman, there's an incredibly important leader near Hebron. He used to stand in front of the Israeli troops when they were shooting at the protesters to say, you know, don't shoot them, you leave them alone, physically put his body in front of them. A sheikh who had prominence, one of the important tribes there, he did the same thing he's always done. And the Israeli military showed up at his home, allegedly, and beat him to death. He has died, 66-year-old man who is known for anyone that's been to Hebron. Those are the kinds of things that continue to happen. I would have never, I'm naively optimistic on that way, to think that that would have been allowed to continue and expand, as opposed to a year later, we've trying to figure out how to address the horror that's taken place.
Maya Berry, thank you.
Thank you for having me.